Moving to the next topic, which is forms. Again, another beast of a topic, but let's just get a feel of the same. One topic which I had a love-hate relationship in Angular is forms. There are two types of forms: template-driven form for simple use cases and reactive forms for more complex use cases, as it provides a more robust and predictable way to manage form state. With reactive forms, we define the structure of the form and its controls in the TypeScript code. When we import reactive forms module into the imports array, we are essentially telling Angular, hey, I want to use reactive forms, so give me access to all the tools and directives I need to make them work. Various services like form builder, form control, form group, form array, etc. gets unlocked with this module registration. The Reactive Forms module provides essential directives that connect our TypeScript form models to our HTML templates. For example, form group directive says, hey, I will make sure the form group in the class is bound to the form element in the template. And form control name directive says, I will bind individual controls that fall within the form group to input elements inside the form. When a user types in an input field, the directive updates the form model. When you programmatically change the form model in TypeScript, the directive updates the DOM. All of this happens automatically once the module is registered. We also get access to Angular's reactive validation system. That is reactive forms in a nutshell without going too deep into it. Let's begin by injecting a form builder class. We do private read-only FB, whatever name we want, equal to inject form builder. Form builder is a helper service that makes creating forms less verbose. Usually creating reactive forms from scratch is a painstaking process. Using form builder helps making that process a bit more easier. Next step is to declare a property to form group. By assigning form group to myForm, we make this property hold the form container. On the left side, we can see that form is a wrapper within which we have multiple input controls. So similarly, we will be also having individual form controls within the form group. We'll come to that in a bit. ngOnInit is a lifecycle hook. By the time this hook runs, our component, its inputs, dependency injection, everything else will be ready. So once that is done, let's create our form within the ngOnInit lifecycle hook. Let's do this.myForm equal to this.fb. So form builder dot, it will allow us to create a form group. So fb.group, pass in a configuration object within which we can set the keys. So in the left side, we have an input for name and an input for email. So let's have a key called name whose initial value is empty, and it should have validation called required attached to it. So this should not be empty. If it is empty, the form should be invalid. Similarly, let's add one more key called email corresponding to the input email on the left side. Its initial value is empty, but we don't need to apply any validations for this particular control. Before submitting, we are checking, hey, if this form is fully valid, then go ahead and submit the form. Let's console the form to see the values of the form, and then call reset to reset the form altogether. Now that the class is ready, next step is to hook it up with the HTML by adding some directives or special markers. Let's attach the form group directive, and with the property binding, we dynamically bind the same to the myForm property in the class. Then we add a custom event and bind the same to the onSubmit, which makes sure that we don't need to call the prevent default manually when a form is submitted, because default form submissions will trigger an action otherwise. Since we need to check validations and submit the form based on various conditions, adding this custom event is a must. When we attach form control name to the input control, we are binding the key, in our case, the name key in the TypeScript class to this control in the template. Similar is the case for the email input too. Before submission, if the form is invalid, we can disable the submit form based on the form validity so that invalid forms are never submitted. Since the name key has a validators.required attached to it, we need to make sure that the input with the form control name of name also has that validation. So here, let's do if myform.get of name. So basically, if this form control is invalid and this form control is touched. So once the user touched the input control and if that is invalid, then show this particular message. I have already connected this form with the app.html. So let's go back to the web view and see how it works. We have two input controls, one for the name and one for the email. Name has a validation attached to it, email doesn't have. The button will be initially invalid because the name is invalid. The moment we touch the name and go outside, the validation kicks in and says name is required. The moment we provide a name and an email value and submit the form, we can see that the form is properly submitted. Whatever value we entered here is made available within this submit of the form. If things are still not clear, I will explain it again once we do the project exercise. Like I said before, forms is something that I initially had a tough time getting my head around. So if you fully didn't understand the concept at this point, I get it. Don't worry, hang in there. The more practice we do, the more easier it becomes. The objective is to create a new component with a reactive form that allows the users to add new recipes to the application. We need to create a new component. It should have a reactive form with form builder, form control, form group, and it should also have name, description, image URL, is favorite. For the time being, we don't need to add ingredients. The form should also have basic validation. And once the form is submitted, a new recipe should be added to the application's data, and it should also appear in the recipe list when we navigate back to the /recipes. Lot of requirements. Let's tackle one by one. Let's get to it. Since I am assuming that you know the basics like creating a component, adding the styles and HTML, these doesn't involve anything new. So I have done them behind the scenes so that I can focus on the actual concept rather than spending time on setup. But rest assured, I'll walk you through them piece by piece. In terminal, I issued this command, nggc add-recipe. So it scaffolded a new component. We can see it in our IDE. It created an add-recipe folder within which we have our 4 usual files. In the app.routes.ts, above the recipe/id, I added a new route. This is for recipe/new, and I added the component add recipe. This is the new component which we just scaffolded. I went to the add-recipe ts file and I imported Reactive Forms module. Because we are creating reactive forms, and for that we need to register Reactive Forms module. I already had some snippets for HTML and CSS for the form, so I added the same here. This is a bare minimum HTML CSS for add new recipe, for name, for description, for image URL, for marking it as favorite, and a submit button, and a corresponding CSS for that. Nothing new. In the web view, if we navigate to recipes/new, we should be seeing this one. At this point, what we have is just a component with HTML and CSS. We haven't added anything form related. That's what we are going to do next. In add-recipe.ts, the very first thing that we need to do is to register our Reactive Forms module within the imports array. That is already ready. The next step is to bring in our form builder. For that, let's do private read-only fb equal to inject form builder. The next step is to bring in the recipe service. because we need to add one more method, a add new recipe method, because once the form is submitted, the logic to add a new item to the existing recipes is handled by the recipe service. So that method needs to be added in the service. The next thing to bring is router, because once the form is submitted, we need to programmatically navigate back to the recipes route. For that, we need router. Let's create a property and assign form group to it so that the add recipe form becomes the container. Within the ng on init, let's call this dot add recipe form equal to, let's assign this to the this dot form builder dot group. Within this group, let's add the configuration object and pass the properties, the keys that we need for this. Let's pass name with an initial value of empty string, description with an initial value of empty string, image URL also with an initial value of empty string, is favorite with an initial value of false, and then once we are trying to submit the form, if the form is valid, then do the logic. Since the service is not ready yet, we'll fill this a bit later. In the recipe service, let's add a new method called add new recipe. Whatever the form submits is available within the arguments here. So let's collect the recipe as the argument, but the type is partial of recipe model. The reason being, when the form is submitted, we collect the name, description, image URL and is favorite, but not the ID. That ID is getting generated within this function. So to accommodate that requirement and to make TypeScript happy, we say, yes, we still collect the property that's expected, but not all of them. Within this method, let's call this dot recipe dot update, get the existing ones through items, spread it so that we are creating a new array and not mutating the existing one, and create a new object with the ID of this dot recipes dot length. So if we have 2 items, make the ID 3, but not just 3, make sure that it's a number and not a string. The name comes from the recipe.name or as a fallback, an empty string. Description comes from recipe.description or a fallback of empty string. IsFavorite comes from recipe.isFavorite or as a default false. Ingredients, for the time being, let's not worry about that. Let's put an empty array. Image URL comes from recipe.imageURL or an empty string. Now that this add new recipe is up and running, let's go to add-recipe.ts and fill in the on submit. Here we say if the form is valid, then let's console the value so that we know what we are submitting. And on top, let's call the this.recipe-service dot the new method which we just created, that is the add new recipe, and pass the recipe form dot value. So whatever the submissions, we pass it to the add new recipe method. After that, let's navigate back to the recipes. So call this dot router dot navigate by URL and go back to the recipes page. And to wire the form which we created dynamically in the class to the template, let's go to add-recipe.html. In the form, let's add a property form group. Let's dynamically bind it with the property binding and say add recipe form. Let's also bring in the event handler ng submit equal to on submit. For the input, let's add form control name equal to name. Let's copy this, paste it here and change this for description. Copy this and paste it here for img URL. Same goes here for the isFavorite. is favorite. And for the button, let's add a disabled. If not, add recipe form dot valid. So if the form is invalid, then disable this button. Let's head back to the web view to see if this is working or not. Refresh. Let's enter green salad. Tasty green salad. Image URL. Let's mark it as favorite and click on add recipe. Now we can see that the form is submitted with this many values. It navigated back to the recipes page. If we click G, we know that there is green salad. And if we click on it, we can see it navigated to the new ID and show us the green salad with the is favorite set to true. Since there is no ingredients at this point, this is empty, but the functionality is working fine. Now, the only thing that is missing is adding validations. That's what we are going to do next. To add validations to add-recipe.ts, within the form builder group, along with the initial value, let's pass validators.required. So this field becomes a required field. Similarly, let's also add validators.required for description. For bigger forms, rather than filling the HTML with a lot of logic, some of those logic can be offloaded to the TS file. We can add a getter property. The name can be anything we want. Here I'm giving recipe name, and then let's access this .addRecipeForm.get of name. Instead of writing this thing in template, we can use this getter property. Similarly, let's also add recipe description. We do this .addRecipeForm.get of description. Make sure to return this, else this will not work. Getters always need a return value. Also for validations, we can add more helper utilities. Let's add isNameValid and return if the recipe name has errors, specifically if there is a required error, and if the recipe name field is touched, then this is true. Similarly, let's add isDescription invalid, similar to the name invalid. Here also we return this recipe description if the errors exist and if that error is required field error, and if the recipe description is touched, then isDescription invalid is true. If we want, we can write similar things in template, but that will bloat the template. So to avoid that, we offload some of these things into the TS file. In the template, it becomes much easier now. Let's write @if isName invalid. If the name is invalid, then add a span with a class of error message and show name is invalid. Similarly, let's do the same for description. If the isDescription invalid is true, then show a span with the class of error message and say description is invalid. To confirm if this logic is working fine or not, let's go back to the web view. Let's touch and then leave. It shows the error. It shows the error here also. The moment I fill these two, the add recipe button becomes valid. So the validation functionality is also working fine. And confirm the same with Gemini CLI by typing done. And finally, after reviewing all the file, it says, excellent. You have successfully created a new component with a reactive form to add new recipes to the application. This is a significant step in making the application interactive and dynamic. That's it for this video. Moving to the last topic in the playlist, which is more of a bonus module to introduce you to Angular material, which is a component library created by the same team who built Angular. See you soon. Thank you and bye bye.